Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today we continue with our periodic look at original Beach Boy album covers. Last time we looked at 1980's Keepin' the Summer Alive and 1985's The Beach Boys. This time we close out the 80s with the Beach Boys' kinda, sort of new album from 1989, Still Cruisin'. A cursory glance at this and you can see why I think it might not necessarily belong in this group. I'm going to put it in here anyway. But so far we haven't talked about album covers for any compilations, any archival releases, any collections, only original Beach Boy albums. And while a lot of this is things that had already been released, the Beach Boys seem to treat it as if it were a new album. Hence its inclusion here. Released on September 28, 1989, the album included a few new tracks, some fairly recent soundtrack cuts, the Wipeout single from a couple of years earlier, and 3 greatest hits cuts whose inclusion is rationalized because they'd been included in film soundtracks going back as far as 1983. You certainly can't escape the impression that these 3 tracks, I Get Around, Wouldn't It Be Nice, and California Girls, are added both to pad out the album and to make the release a little bit more palatable for the general public. Beach Boy fans, of course, found themselves forced to buy these 3 tracks yet again. I won't get into reviewing the album itself here, we'll save that for another episode, but one look at the track listing and you can see that this is clobbed together from a number of different sources. It's not really a cohesive Beach Boy album. I believe the title Still Cruisin' was probably chosen just because it was their most recent single. It had been featured on the soundtrack of Lethal Weapon 2, which was released in July of '89, and also released as a single on July 8th, 1989, which is nearly 3 months before the Still Cruisin' album hit the stores. It may have been an unfortunate choice of titles because, as I remember at the time, the critics used it as an opening to call it things like Barely Moving or Still Coasting. The front cover features a modified version of the Chevrolet Corvette double flag emblem, particularly as it was seen in the mid-60s. This is the 1964, 1965, and 1966 emblems. The flag on the right is, of course, the checkered racing victory flag. The flag on the left is a creation of the Chevrolet art department. Until 4 days before the Corvette was introduced to the public in 1952, this was an American flag. Just before it was released, somebody discovered that it was illegal to use an American flag on an advertising logo, so it was replaced with a fleur-de-lis representing the French-Swiss heritage of Louis Chevrolet with 3 lines under it, and the Chevrolet logo. On the album cover, the Chevy logo has been turned into an ellipse inside a rectangle. For the cover of the Still Cruising single, the logo has been modified yet again with a double B, presumably for Beach Boys, replacing the fleur-de-lis. It's presented in a sort of a Rolls-Royce type configuration, and some swirly lines where the Chevrolet logo originally appeared. I'm not sure if those swirly lines on the cover of the single have any significance in car culture or any place else. Please let me know if those mean something. Getting back to the album cover itself, the back cover is just red with the shadow of some palm trees. Of course, you have a track listing, some credits, and extensive liner notes by a Del Porter dated June 1989. Many of the tracks, of course, are listed as being from the film, and there are lots of asterisks indicating the many producers and co-producers of the various tracks. Once again, pointing out, if you hadn't noticed already, that this is put together from a lot of sources and sessions. The inner sleeve is simply a plastic bag, so it's done on the cheap. This really wasn't unusual late in the 80s. By 1989, record companies seemed intent on getting everybody to switch over to CDs, so a lot of vinyl releases seemed put together deliberately cheaply and almost grudgingly, making it clear that the preferred and better release was the CD. For such an uninteresting and almost generic album cover, there are an awful lot of art credits on the back cover. Tommy Steele is credited with art direction. DNZ, the design group, credited with design. They did a lot of Chess reissue album covers in the early 80s. And Tom Utley is credited with the cover illustration. He had done covers for Stryper's The Yellow and Black Attack And earlier in 1989, Stevie Nicks' The Other Side of the Mirror album. Another thing you might have noticed on the back cover and on the record label itself is the Capitol Records credit. The Beach Boys returned briefly to Capitol Records at this point, and the familiar Capitol logo appears on a Beach Boy record for the first time in 20 years. The narrative liner notes on the back of the album are probably the most extensive of any Beach Boy album, and this is probably because the existence of this album requires a great deal of explaining. Of course, the theme is that the Beach Boys have been around for 27 years and are still cruising, having had a #1 hit just the prior year. It goes on to explain where each one of the tracks comes from and to try to justify the inclusion of the older tracks to pad out the album. By the way, does anybody know who Del Porter is, who's credited as having written the liner notes in June of 1989? A Google search turned up jazz musician Del Porter, who lived from 1902 to 1977. Even Discogs has the Del Porter who wrote the liner notes linked to jazz musician Del Porter, who most certainly was not writing liner notes for Beach Boy albums 12 years after his death. When I talked in earlier episodes about Beach Boy album covers and suggested that possibly the MIU album or the Beach Boys '85 album were the worst Beach Boy album covers of all time, I wasn't thinking about Still Cruisin'. This has got to be the most uninspiring of all original Beach Boy album covers, though in a way it's appropriate. It's a cover that doesn't promise much, and that's just what the album delivers. But we'll save that, as I say, for another time. Moving on to 1992 and the CD era, we got Summer in Paradise. From here on, we'll be looking at albums on CD. As I mentioned, by the late 80s, vinyl was very much being phased out. For me, the CD era really began in 1990. The last two brand new vinyl releases that I purchased for a very long time, I bought them on the same day, were Nick Lowe's Party of One album and They Might Be Giants Flood, which I purchased in January of 1990. From there on, I was buying new albums on CD. So I was well into CDs by August 3rd, 1992, when I drove to Aaron's Records in Hollywood on the day of release to pick up, grudgingly, the new Beach Boys album, Summer in Paradise. I'd read about Summer in Paradise and did not have high hopes for the album. Of course, I went ahead and bought it anyway. Once again, there are no pictures of the Beach Boys anywhere on the album. Instead, we get 4 paintings by Robert Lynn Nelson, whose fantasy paintings of marine wildlife were very popular at the time. I knew Nelson's work from having seen it for sale in art stores and malls alongside things like prints of sports cars and Disney characters and tourist spots, so my impression of his work was that it was a little lowbrow and a little kitschy. But personal taste aside, I will defend this album cover as at least having a vision and some ambition and being appropriate for the subject matter, which is something I've complained that a lot of Beach Boy album covers lack. There are a number of songs on the album with environmental themes that are certainly reflected in Robert Lynn Nelson's work. Whatever else you might say about it, the Summer in Paradise cover has a distinct and suitable artistic vision. For the first time in many, many years, we get more than the bare minimum out of Beach Boy album cover art. This thing opens up into 4 separate sections in something called an eco pack, which I'll talk more about later. You even get a little mini poster here and at least partial reproductions of 4 Robert Lynn Nelson paintings, including Elements of the Universe from 1988, which is used on the outside cover, Embraced by the Sea from 1988 on the inside panel, split into 2 sections. You can see the rocks at the bottom of one panel, at the top of another panel. The painting Amethyst Dawn at Kipahulu from 1980, a tiny portion of which appears on the flap for the poster on the inside panel. Apparently Nelson and Mike Love were neighbors in Maui, and the full painting is a view of Mike Love's property from Nelson's house. Those 3 paintings already existed and were chosen by the Beach Boys, or probably more chosen by Mike Love, to be part of the album cover. And you've got to wonder if the fact that one of these paintings was Mike Love's property played into it. But actually the portion of the painting that is reproduced on the album cover doesn't show the property, it just shows the ocean. The 4th and final painting was called Ring of Life, and it was commissioned by the Beach Boys, or probably more commissioned by Mike Love. It appears on the inside cover and is also the subject of the enclosed mini poster. I've got to say, I find the big American flag and the fireworks at the top of the painting really off-putting. As I've said before, I find the whole America's band thing distasteful. I dislike the group wrapping themselves in a veneer of American patriotism. For one thing, it's not particularly creative. And to me, appealing to patriotism seems like a cheap way to try to ingratiate yourself with people. Also, let's not forget there are a lot of great bands from America, so giving themselves this title is a little presumptuous and pompous. And finally, I find it a little bit disrespectful to try to co-opt America itself into a promotional slogan for a band, for any band, maybe with the exception of the U.S. Marine Corps band. I'm probably overstating the case. I don't want to make too big a deal of it. It's not a big deal, but I would be real happy if that whole America's band thing was just quietly dropped. There are some other interesting details in this particular painting, including a dirigible or a missile or something with Happy 30th written on the side, 1992 being the 30th year of the Beach Boys. There also appears to be something written in the clouds that I can't quite make out. You can only see part of it on the cover, but it's visible in the wider version of the painting that's on the mini poster. Any idea what that says? I didn't realize at the time that the figure at the bottom is meant to be the soon-to-be Mrs. Mike Love Jacqueline Pison, rather than just the usual generic bikini-clad young woman that gets stuck on Beach Boy album covers. Somehow knowing this makes it worse. It reminds me of those European portrait painters who used to try to flatter their wealthy patrons by doing attractive renditions of their family members. I'm sure Mrs. Mike Love is a very attractive woman, but having her included here makes me feel like it's less about the Beach Boys and their fans than it is about Mike Love's ego. In the spring 2017 edition of Endless Summer Quarterly, Robert Lynn Nelson talks about how he came to paint her. I had a house on the beach at the time, and I had a guest room. They, meaning Mike and Jacqueline, came and stayed for 3 or 4 days, and I photographed her all over the place, on the beach, on my lawn, laying on a surfboard, and then I worked from the photographs after they left and incorporated her into the painting in that way. Painting a figure like that takes me about a week as I try to get the details accurate, and this is the highly detailed portrait he came up with. The back of the mini poster has a track listing, liner notes, credits, and a long narrative by Mike Love talking about how he and Terry Melcher came up with the idea to make this album the quintessential soundtrack of summer. He summarizes the songs, talks about ecology, and the title track Summer in Paradise, which is the only song whose lyrics are reproduced. It certainly leaves the impression, probably correctly, that this is more a Mike and Terry album than a Beach Boys album. The UK version is a lot different. For one thing, it comes in a standard CD pack, and weirdly, the American flag is reproduced on the front cover. There's no mini poster and a total of 3 panels of art. The bottom half of Elements of the Universe and both halves of Ring of Life, but oddly they don't line up when you open up the cover. The back has the liner notes, but they're reproduced so small that they're practically impossible to read. The US version got some press at the time for its pioneering use of the Eco Pack, which never really caught on, but it was supposed to use less materials, particularly plastic, and therefore be more environmentally friendly. There was a lot of discussion at the time about the wastefulness of CD packaging, especially as CDs still came in shrink-wrapped long boxes, which fit better into existing record bins and, more importantly, were harder to shoplift, but used a lot of cardboard that would get ripped open and immediately thrown away. By the way, does anybody remember a rumor around this time, these early CD days, that if you took a green marker and went around the edge of your CDs that they'd sound a lot better? I never tried that, but I remember people telling me you really need to do that. Put that green mark around the edge and sound quality will be much, much better. Anyway, no idea about that. The Eco Pack was kind of a good idea. It got the album some needed publicity. It tied in with the environmental theme. It provided a lot of room for the reproduction of artwork, and it just sort of gave the album a unique look. Of course, a lot of people have observed that the most eco-friendly thing the Beach Boys did here was to produce an album that nobody would ever want to make very many copies of. A lot of negative things have been said about this album, but if we're just talking about the cover, I will defend it on the basis that it's the first Beach Boy album in over 10 years that shows some ambition and some desire to give something above the bare minimum by including the Eco Pack, the poster, and presenting a clear, cohesive theme that ties in with the music on the album. We will talk about the music on that album another time. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this fun and interesting. I'd love to get your comments and hear your feedback. I know sometimes I've gotten comments, like particularly on the MIU cover, that have kind of changed my perspective on what I'd said. So love to hear your feedback. Please like and subscribe. Looking forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.